Thank you. I'm Ellen Browne and I'm a writer. Bad Water is my 10th novel for teens and young people. And I'm also a creative writing teacher. And I thought it might be a good idea for me to talk to you a bit about my book and also about creative writing and why I think it's a really great thing to do, particularly in times like these when we're all a bit stuck and normal things aren't going on. We're probably quite fed up of screens as well. I love reading, first of all, and you can probably tell that from all the books around me, because I think reading, opening the cover of a book is like opening a door onto another world. And I'm the kind of reader, I just disappear. I lose myself for days on end in another adventure story or whatever it is I'm reading. And as a writer, I'm a bit the same. I find that in writing that you can do all kinds of things that you can't do in the usual world. One of the things that you can do is you can kind of deal with things that frighten you and worry you in a way that's really positive. You can escape from your daily life in the things that you live in your imagination. And in writing, you can give yourself superpowers. In fact, you kind of have superpowers because the minute you start writing a story, you're able to share your thoughts with somebody else, share your imagination with somebody else in a way that's really difficult to do in any other way. So I'd like to talk to you really about how I went about writing the story and the kind of things I used to make it work. And I'd like maybe you to do some writing too. So if you could make sure that you have pen, paper, something that you can work with, that would be fantastic. And I will talk a little bit about how I first came up with the idea for Bad Water. So stories are all about things happening, and some of the things that happen have got to be scary to make an interesting story. So it's quite a good idea sometimes to think about the things that frighten you, because they will be things that you'll be able to write about in a really powerful way. I'm pretty well scared of everything, so it's not hard for me to find things that scare me. But putting them out there in a story allows you to kind of explore the feelings associated with them, and you can kind of conquer the fear by making the character, not usually you, but someone you put in the story, overcome all those difficulties. And it can be a really good way of dealing with them. So I want you to list the top 10 top fears, big ones maybe like climate change, but small ones too about, falling or not having any friends or struggling with work or whatever they would be. Just write them down really quickly and we'll come back in 2 minutes. So you can see that I've got big fears like climate change, making a really bad decision, and then other small fears like being in tight places. And these are reflected in my stories. So you might be wondering what all this fear has to do with writing a novel. I think the idea for Bad Water very much stems from my real fear of global warming and rising sea levels. I live quite close to the Thames, so and it floods, it's tidal, so it floods regularly. And it doesn't take very much imagination to see how just 1 metre or 2 metres of rise in sea levels would really destroy all of where I live and central London and most of this part of the country. Most of the country actually that isn't on high places. So I started thinking about that. There's on the towpath where I used to walk, there's an old barge and it's sort of falling apart, and there's a lot of there's got barges next to it sort of with herbs and things, and it's clearly the people who live on it are making things from bits of old scrap and bicycles. And it got me thinking about how people would survive, how they would trade, how they'd manage in a time when money is no longer useful and where there's a shortage of food and clean water and no organised government. So that was the kind of the setting for the story. And then I started thinking about the people in it and what they'd have to overcome. So very briefly, the story figures Olu, who is the barger who lives on the Ark, an old barge that was built before the chaos, before global warming happened, and 2 other people, Buzz and Rata. And the problem is that Olu's mother becomes very sick and needs help. She has just had twins too. And in order to get someone to look after her mother, because in times of plague, no one's very keen, when people know what plague is, no one's very keen to look after someone who's ill. In order to persuade someone to help her, she has to agree to go into the part of London that is most dangerous, the remains of the old city known as Badwater, because there's a rumour that there's a cache of weapons there. And she needs to take these weapons back to the people looking after her mother because they're under attack. Because there's not very much good land left. Most of it's underwater. So if you do have good growing land, then you have to defend it constantly. And the story really is of how Olu tries to achieve this. And it's a difficult job. Anyway, I will read you a little bit from the beginning, which just is to show you a little bit about some of the things that I worry about and which came out in the story. Olu found her mother's face by touch alone. She was hot. At least she wasn't dead. Not yet. The dead were cold. She let out the breath that she'd been holding in a kind of shaky sob. Ma wasn't dead, but she had a fever. That much was sure. If her mother had the water fever, the wet plague, they would all die, and quickly. Olu touched her mother's face again. There was no doubt she was on fire with heat. Olu screamed out all the bad words her mother would let her say into the wind until her throat was raw. The wind whipped them away as if they'd never been said. Ma always said if she got the fever, Olu was to leave her landside and fend for herself. Ma had made a promise. It was wet plague that did it for the preakers. The barges only made it through because they knew what to do, and they did it. There was no mercy if there was plague. You could fire a boat if there was plague. There was no salvage if there was plague. Everything had to burn if there was plague. But was it plague? How could she tell? There had been no cases for a long while. The word was that plague only lurked in bad water. Most times that would have reassured Olu. Olu felt make her feel safer. But they were in bad water, had been there since the birthing. Ma had risked everything for good salvage, enough to keep them going while she nursed the twins, plus a bit extra to put by for the babes' naming should they survive their first year. What had Ma done? Olu buried her own face against the sodden fabric of Ma's shirt. Even through the cloth, her mother felt hot as a jenny, hotter than the furnace on the island of spring. What was the right thing to do? If she left Ma to die, the twins would follow soon after. Ma! Ma! Wake up! Tell me what to do! And I think, this is also a theme of the book, that really my main characters are left to fend for themselves because all the adults in their lives are unable to help. And I think that's a fear too, to not know what to do and to have all the weight of decision-making on your own shoulders. So that is another really strong theme of this book. So when I say it's really, the whole story is fueled by fear, I'm not exaggerating. So Olu lives on a barge which is called the Ark, and it has trail barges behind it because it was designed just before the chaos, as I'm calling it, when global warming really happened and most of the cities and a lot of land flooded. And these trail barges have place for animals. They have sort of goats and things. They've got crops that they grow, unusual crops, herbs that they can use for medicine, and also another barge which contains all the salvage that they can get, because the barges, they get bits of old tech and bits and pieces to make new things, because they've kind of retained some knowledge about how our technology works, and they use it to trade on the waterways. That's all that's left of our world now. So I just wanted to give a little glimpse of it there. I'm calling Preka refers to the people pre-chaos, which is us basically. The great river was wide here, as broad as a lake, and she strained her eyes for any signs of the stock or the barges, but all they could see was the still raging water and the marshes of the distant banks. When the river was low, you could see the ghosts of Preka buildings, spires and scrapers making drag waters, salvage grounds and difficult steering, but the river was too high. This was a dangerous time. It was hard to know when you might be floating over bar-dripping debris. She tied her wild frizz of hair back off her face with her headscarf and peered at the river ahead. She refused to think about her mother and the babes below. Not yet. She could not cope with everything. The other character in this story is a boy called Buzz, who has, his father was a kind of genius, and they managed to build a plane that crossed the Atlantic from America to the Isles of Britain. But the father is killed in the crash. So Buzz, like Olu, is left a young man having to make decisions about in a world that he knows very little about. He doesn't know anybody here. And I wanted to give you a bit of a glimpse of his situation, which I found quite frightening, and a little bit more about the post-chaos world. Buzz picked the closest tree and shunned up it quicker than a wildcat, even though it was slick and slippery with rain. He had to get his loud and frightened breathing under control. He'd been in danger before. He knew what to do. The owners of the voices were close. He strained to listen. The accent was strange to him, so strange he wasn't even sure if they were speaking his own language. The man made no effort to be silent. A dog barked, and he felt his panic rise. All dogs at home were bred to guard, and he'd once seen what his father's Rottweiler had done to an intruder which broke into the compound. That memory had filled his nightmares ever since. Buzz was trembling, which wouldn't do. He didn't want to set the tree branch shaking. He tried to focus only on the voices which were coming closer. They did not sound friendly. A man with a deep voice was laughing. You're not wrong. We don't need to worry about that old bitch. We've got the sons, so she's over. But once our machete men are done with their boozing and binting, we need to rethink the defences, especially along the river. The Dassos were lazy, lucky for us. I'm not going to get caught making the same mistake as they did. A gaffer man can only have what he can hold. Even though the man's low voice was hard for even Buzz's keen ears to hear, the tone was clear. The man was frighteningly determined. It's a guzzling lot of land, Stitch, a massive holding, and we'll need to use fighting men to tend it. We finished too many of the yokel judges, and as for the survivors, the second, lighter voice tailed off as if reluctant to spell out what must have been obvious. The rest will work for us or starve, Deep Voice said shortly. They know Dasso's done for. Live or die, that's their choice. His voice carried on, but became a little bit more than a drone as the man moved away. Buzz couldn't see much from his position high in the tree's crown. He hoped that meant he couldn't be seen. He only got a glimpse of two figures from behind the patchwork curtain of foliage. They were dressed oddly, in old-timers' bikers' leathers and thin plastic rain capes. The only bit of homespun he could see was in the stripes of purple cloth they tied round their heads. One man was dark-skinned and black-haired, the other fair. Both were bearded. One carried an antique Kalashnikov slung along his brawny shoulder, and the other held a spear. Buzz knew that his eyesight was exceptionally good, according to Pa anyway, but there were times when he questioned it. He was certain of one thing, though. These men were the neobarbs Pa was so worried about, men of violence to be avoided. He thought about reaching for his own weapons, but he'd have to let go of the branch, and his chance of making a noise or even falling were too high. He was not going to risk that. It was not cowardly to be cautious. All the way through, the other thing that Buzz is afraid of is his letting down the memory of his father, because his father was very keen on his son being made of what he called the right stuff. So that's another kind of thread of fear that runs through it. There's lots more. I mentioned in my list that I was frightened of tight spaces and Buzz has to crawl under a wall. I hate being underwater, and both Buzz and Olu have to go underwater to repair damage to the barge. I'm frightened of being under attack, and Olu has to defend the barge, and they all have to do loads of fighting. And everywhere is dangerous, and I'm frightened of dangerous places. But the interesting thing about it is that it helps you to write a story, because you think about the elements, the dangers, how that would make you feel, what in particular would worry you, and you stick it all in your story. And that is a really it's a really useful thing to do with those fears, but it also, I think, makes for a really entertaining story, because you can bring the reader in with you to experience those sensations. And you know, the next trick is, having put your characters in a really, really difficult position, the really good part is that you can help get them out. We have our list of our fears that you've just written. Have a look at it and maybe pick one or two that you think you can put together into a scene. And I'd like you then to escape into your imagination, away from your surroundings, cut out all the noise, everything else that's around you, and just focus on being in this place, in this situation that you've imagined. So I want you to think obviously about all the sensory detail. People will always tell you about that. I mean, close your eyes and picture it. Imagine what the air feels on your skin, or maybe you're underwater at the top of a mountain. Maybe it's cold, or maybe it's wet, or maybe it's somewhere really dark and you can't see, or you feel oppressed. Think about everything, what you can smell, what it feels like to be wearing your clothes, or to be trapped in a small space, or with the water against your skin. Whatever it is, think about it and take 10 minutes to write the scene, to describe what it feels like to be there. And you can include a little bit of your feelings. Don't go over the top. Don't make it all about your racing heart and your panic, because we need to know, the reader needs to know what it is that's frightening you and how you feel when you're frightened. But think about putting those two things together in a little scene for about 10 minutes. I think that'd be quite an interesting exercise. To talk to you a little bit about superpowers. I love them. I mean, who doesn't love a story with superpowers in it? But there are different kinds, aren't there? You get the kind where, you know, you've got like a Superman thing, or you've got one where you've got magic, or another where you've got kind of supernatural insight. And I think they're all really interesting in stories, and I've written a lot about different kinds of powers. But there's another kind of power too that I'm also interested in, the kind of power that comes from being really good at something. You know, someone with an incredible talent that they've really worked at, you know, like a really good sprinter, or, you know, someone who can play music really brilliantly well or something. And I can see those are also kind of superpowers. And there's another too, which I like to include in my story, which is I like characters who are very strong, not necessarily physically strong, but strong-minded, clear about what they believe. My character Olu is actually a very small person. She's not hugely strong in the normal sense, but she's very strong-willed, and she has a very strong sense of what's right and wrong. In her community. I mean, perhaps it's not the same as what you and I might consider right and wrong, because she does some pretty awful things, but she's doing what she believes is right within the context of her own community and trying to save her family. And then she's also very brave, and because I'm not, as you will have gathered from my long list of fears, I really admire that and regard that as a superpower. Youth is another superpower. Being young, you're often made to feel like it's the worst thing in the world. But I really do believe that young people will save the world from the climate change that I'm so worried about. I think it's up to you, and I think you will be able to do it. So that's one of the reasons why I write for young adults, because I think that when you're young, you're so much clearer about what needs doing, and you see things perhaps more simply than when you're older, in that you can see this is a really bad thing and this is a really good thing. And adults or older people sometimes get all a bit blurry about that. So I think there's huge power in being passionate about something, about being committed to something. And in my characters in my story tend to have those characteristics, which I like to think of as a superpower. I'd like to read you a very brief extract now, which is from, it's near the beginning, and Buzz, the character I've spoken about, he has escaped. He was enslaved and met this boy called Rata, and the two of them have escaped. They've seen the boat that Olu is on, the Ark, and they've boarded it. And that doesn't sound awful, but it's a disaster for Olu, because the Ark is a matriarch boat, which means there are no boys allowed on it. So she let Rata on out of compassion because he was drowning, and now she's in a bit of a mess. And this is how she gets out of it. So her anger made her bold. With a show of meekness, she went to the cabin and brought out a couple of blankets and the revolver, hiding the one under the other. She threw one blanket over the shivering, choking boy, coughing out his guts on the clean deck, and went as if to throw the other over the shoulder of the bigger boy. Instead, she pressed the barrel of the gun into his back. Drop my spear gun on the floor and kick it away. Not near the boy, over there. Put your hands in the air very slowly, and if you think I won't kill you where you stand, you don't know much about barges. You have defiled my boat and you will pay. Her voice sounded coldly angry. She actually had to fight not to pull the trigger. She was so ashamed of what had happened. If pulling the trigger would have wiped away the shame, she would have done it, but it would only bring her more trouble. They were not so far from the Roberts that they would not hear the report of a gun, and the Roberts would follow in canoe, kayak or dinghy. The boy dropped the spear gun and raised his hands as she'd requested. Now what? Get back in the river or I'll blow your head off. Please, I can help you. Yeah, by shooting me with my own spear gun. Get in the water or I'll shoot. Wait! The boy, called Ratter, levered himself up from the deck. You need him. I've seen it. We're all linked together like a braid. We all need each other. You'll only get everything you want on your trade lift to save your ma if we stay with you. What did he know of her problems with her ma? Had he been spying on her? What do you mean? When I was in the water, I had a vision. A true one. Ascending. There's trouble ahead, miss, and you can't take it all on by yourself. I know you're tough. I've seen that too, but you need backup. You need us. This was nonsense. A clever con. What do you know about Ma? The man with one leg will help her. He's got guts. My sister Ali, she's never backed down from anything in her life. She's mixed up with your Ma too. Your Ma needs you to come back with all the and you most likely won't, not without us. How could he know these things? Had Ali told him? There was no doubt this was Ali's brother, but she'd had no time to brief him about Joji. Olu shivered. The hairs on her neck were standing up as if a river ghoul danced with her soul. She faltered. Why should I believe such nonsense? Her uncertainty had leaked into her voice, and she hated herself for that. That was something a good negotiator never allowed to happen. You should believe it because it's true. I've seen a future where you lie dead on this deck and ditched in the water without prayer or ceremony, another where you return triumphant with a hole full of weapons. The boy was weak after his experience in the water, gulping for breath. The difference between the two visions is us. He was not sure about that. She could tell. He'd seen something more than he was telling, and in that moment she made her decision. I cannot trust you. You can trust me, Marta said confidently, because I believe in my own visions, and if you need me, I need you too. He glanced at Buzz. This mister has his own secret. He's useful, though. He can see in the dark, like properly see, but he'll need to convince you he's straight up himself. Both Ratta and Olu turned to stare at Buzz. You can trust me because I'm a civilized man and I keep my word. He thrust out his hand in Olu's direction, as if he had expected her to shake it. My name is Buzz, and I'm pleased to meet you. It seemed ludicrous to her to shake the hand of someone who'd just thrown her in the water, boarded her boat, and threatened her. And yet, for some reason she did not attempt to understand. She stepped forward and shook his right hand, transferring the revolver into her left. She knew that he could have overpowered her easily if he wanted to. I'm Olu, captain of the Ark, she said. There was a horrible, awkward silence, and then Buzz said, I don't want to worry you, and I'm not saying this just to distract you, but I think we might be about to hit something. So in that little extract, you can see something of Buzz's power and Ratta's power of prophecy, and Olu's strength, I guess, her determination to do what she sees as the right thing. As I said, it isn't always what I think was the right thing, but she is a person of honour in her own way. And what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to look at the scene that you've written, And I want you to think of a way, make a character in that situation and find a way that they may be able to use some special ability, whether it's a natural ability, their natural wit or courage or whatever, or a supernatural ability or a magical ability to get out of the situation. And I think it'd be really great if you could make it into a proper story, and perhaps that you can show them to your teachers, and the best couple could be sent to me, and I will provide a small prize for the best one. Thank you so much. Tonight on What's the Point, we interview N.M. Browne about her latest novel, Bad Water, and find out what on earth she thinks she's playing at. Okay, N.M. Browne, why did you write a dystopian fantasy in a pandemic? Well, I mean, it's a dystopia, but it's a very positive story. I mean, I wanted to write a story that was about all the bad stuff that happened. So the plagues, they've gone, loads of people were killed in fighting and all kinds of things you'd expect when society breaks down. But my story is really about what happens next. So I don't really see it as a dystopia. I see it as something which shows the power of young people to change the world. And I think that's a really good message. So let me get this right. This is a young adult novel which features violence and slavery and a dystopian kind of setup. What was the appeal of this for you? Well, you know, it's got quite a lot of cool stuff in it. I mean, my main character, Olu, is a very brave, feisty, really small girl, but she knows how to wield power, how to persuade people, how to do the right thing. She's very brave and she sticks to her principles. And Rata, he comes from a really difficult place to live, but was much loved by his sisters. He's really, really loyal. And of course, he can see the future, which is quite cool. And then we've got Buzz, who came all the way across the sea with his father from another place. And he's been personally genetically engineered so that he can communicate with computers. I mean, it's a problem that there aren't really that many computers in flooded London, but he can do it, and also he can see in the dark, and who wouldn't want to be able to see in the dark? I mean, it's a minor superpower, but it's one that really appeals to me. And why do you think anyone would want to read this book? I think anybody who loves a good adventure will enjoy this book. It's for boys and for girls because we've got plenty of action and we've got, it's just a really exciting story. Olu has to risk everything because her mother and her baby twins are sick. And in order to persuade someone to care for them in this flooded world that she's in, she has to agree to go to Bad Water, which is where, it's completely flooded and there's these tall remnants of tower blocks covered in vegetation for vertical farms. There's all kind of livestock and things growing. There are these huge kind of swinging bridges between places and this really violent society. And she's heard that there's a cache of old weapons and she has to go there to get them. But the best way to do it is to trade people for weapons, and she won't do that because she's a person of principle. And somehow, with the help of Buzz and Rata, she manages to work it all out so that she ends up having a good trading partnership with the difficult people in the city. I'm not going to tell you whether she saves some other, but it's a really exciting story and I think you'd like it. Thank you very much, N.M. Browne, for your time. And if you do wish to purchase this book, you will find it on Amazon and other sites of that book.